The following episode talks about traumatic scenarios that can lead to spinal cord injuries, and this may be triggering to some of our listeners. Listener discretion is advised. So, how disabled do you need to be eligible for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, or the NDIS? Eligibility within the NDIS is a little bit of a grey area. Under the NDIS Act of 2013, there is no specific diagnosis or disability listed. However, accessing the NDIS can be fraught with problems, from proving your disability is permanent enough to access the scheme, to prioritising which aspect of your disability is the most important one worth fighting for. For a lot of people, their medical condition doesn't qualify to be on the NDIS, despite the condition having lifelong physical impacts. The ripple effect of proving permanent disability can result in underfunded important services and supports to no funding at all. My name is Susan Wood, and for this episode, I talked to Louise Hilton.
I am a senior support coordinator in the community services team. I've been working with SCIA for 4 years. Prior to that, I have worked in supported accommodation and day program scenarios, and I have also worked in occupational rehabilitation.
And Megan Bingham.
I'm on Sydney's policy and advocacy team with a specific focus on systemic advocacy. My background is in human rights.
And we talk about how the seed of the NDIS, which began as an insurance for all disabilities and conditions, quickly moved into a more selective process. We talk about how the selective process of funding has a larger systemic consequence and where the gap in disability education has left a lot of people behind.
So I think I'd preface all of this by saying, the first objective listed under the NDIS Act is that it will empower Australia or ensure that we comply with Australia's obligations under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So this is a major human rights convention that was all based on the social model of disability, understanding that disability is a social construct. It's not a health disability kind of thing, diagnosis, you have a disability. Disability is constructed by society because we have barriers in place and this kind of thing. So in recognizing the social model of disability, we recognize that we need to provide reasonable adjustments. We need to provide people with disability with supports to empower them to live independent lives, which are defined by their own choice and control. Those are the buzzwords associated with the NDIS. But that's the philosophy that it came from, and this is really what we should be focusing on in ensuring that it is the best scheme possible.
For a lot of the people that we're supporting that have had issues with access, it can be things like their injury or their disability may have been sustained when they were a child, and so their information is potentially archived or difficult to access in terms of their diagnosis. So then it's really hard to get a copy of that to actually provide as part of your access request. Or for a lot of people, it'll be something that's a degenerative type of condition, and the NDIS will just view it as a health concern, but that health concern does actually cause significant impairment and disability in that person's life. It's really tricky. And then you have things like MS, which are essentially a degenerative health condition that causes a disability that are very easily accepted, but something like fibromyalgia that has similar effects isn't accepted. Some clients make really good progress with their rehabilitation during their hospitalization, and they end up not needing any aids, but they may still have significant pain or impairment. But because they've made really good progress, the NDIS says they could make more.
So what happens when somebody has two diagnoses?
I mean, you have to pick one as your primary disability, and then that is primarily what the NDIS will fund, supports, assist in managing. So if you have a psychosocial disability and a physical disability, and you pick the psychosocial disability as your primary because to your mind that's the one that has the biggest impact, but actually most of your expenses would be relating to the physical disability, you wouldn't actually have access to any supports for the physical disability potentially.
So I'll start with the legislative background to it. So under the National Disability Insurance Scheme Act of 2013, eligibility is sort of listed under becoming a participant. And essentially, you have to be under 65 years old, you have to be a resident of Australia, permanent resident, citizen, or hold a special visa category. And then you have to fulfill either the disability requirement or the early intervention requirement. What's significant is recognizing that the legislation puts in place that you have to have a permanent impairment or it is likely to be. But it's also important to note that under the legislation, there is no specific diagnosis or disability listed. That's quite an important proviso. You have to have a permanent or likely to be permanent impairment that affects certain areas, domains, communication, mobility, so on and so forth. And this has to have resulted in reduced substantial functional capacity in one of those areas. Or in the early intervention requirements, the expectation is that permanent or likely to be permanent, but with the intervention of certain supports, you will likely benefit and your functional capacity will improve over time. Practicality, eligibility, and access to the NDIS looks a little bit different.
What are your thoughts around people's presentation of self and disability, and how they have to present it to the NDIS to try and get on the NDIS in the first place?
Yes, I have a lot to say on this one. I guess being part of the trial sites up in Newcastle and Port Stephens, there was no information around what that initial assessment was going to look like. Everyone was assured they would have continuity of supports. There was no consistency. We had 2 LACs come to the residents to meet the people who were eligible, because some of them were over 65 by the time they got to us. They asked a lot of questions, which to the participants were confusing. They also asked the families things. They also called the families later, and then they built really inconsistent plans. We had spent so many years working with these people to be independent and to be, able to speak up for themselves and to present themselves, in a strength-based focus, that suddenly to have to turn around and tell them, actually, you need to say you can't do your banking. You can't cook for yourself. You can't make a cup of tea. Even though these were skills that some days these people could do. And it was really challenging and confronting for us as their support workers to have to be saying to them, actually, all that work we've done, we actually need to swap that and reverse it to make sure you get the funding to be able to keep living in this house that you've lived in together for 20 years.
I think the way the NDIS is currently structured, it requires presentation, or not necessarily how the NDIS is structured, but the way the NDIS is administered requires presentation of your disability in a specific way. So I think the way it was initially transitioned, and when all the state and territory disability support programs were transitioning to the NDIS, there are a series of access lists that were produced that listed specific diagnoses that would likely meet the disability requirement and other conditions that would require further assessment. And those lists are very helpful, but again, that's not law. And so we really take away the focus of what is required to meet the legislation. And so it's really left up to the people within the National Disability Insurance Agency in deciding, are you meeting the disability requirements as I understand them? And so it's always meeting the criteria, not necessarily that is legislated for, but has been internalized within policy in the agency. And because of that disjuncture, you have this inconsistency of people who are approving access requests or denying access requests because they simply do not understand how that disability affects a person's life. Even the notion of permanence shouldn't really belong in our discussion of disability itself. Disability and the impact of a person's disability fluctuates day to day, as Louise said. I don't really understand disability, but this is what I've been told. If they've been diagnosed with this, then they should be, or if they've been diagnosed with that, then they probably won't be eligible. So then it requires so much onus on the applicant to gather medical influence that they may not be able to afford and present themselves in a way that they may not necessarily know how to present themselves in a way that will fit the sort of the box that NDIA delegate has in front of them.
So this is something that's come up over and over again. You can have 2 people with the exact same spinal cord injury that present differently, who have different outcomes, who have different, even if they are incomplete, they present differently. When you have a tick box system of what is the expectation of somebody's disability and you're going by that tick box system, it becomes very rigid. People who don't have any knowledge of disability who go into this kind of work have only that to depend on. Does any of you want to talk about why it's so important to have people with a knowledge of that particular disability as part of the NDIS planning process.
If you've got someone who understands the types of supports that someone with a particular disability is likely to need, then they're going to be more receptive to considering those supports instead of just looking at ways that they can cut the plan. If they understand that if you have autism that generally comes with anxiety, that you will need psychology as part of your plan, and that it shouldn't be then placed onto the health system because it's not actually appropriate. They're going to understand the importance of exercise physio in terms of maintaining capacity for transfers in someone with a spinal cord injury, and that will save a significant amount of money in personal care supports. Because if someone can transfer themselves independently from their wheelchair to their bed, to their commode, to the toilet, they don't need a support worker to be paid to do that with them. And once someone is over a certain weight, that doubles to 2 support workers for WHS. So, you're potentially saving a huge amounts of money. Like, you could save $150,000 a year just by funding correct amount of therapy for someone.
Yeah, I think it's multifaceted. There needs to be improvement in a lot of areas. So spinal cord injury is really interesting because you have a cohort of people who are applying for the NDIS with spinal cord injury listed as their primary disability, who are applying for the NDIS from hospital with the assistance of social workers. Then you have the cohort of people who have been living with their spinal cord injury for years and years and years, and they are only recognizing now more of the degenerative effects that have resulted from their spinal cord injury. Some of these people I've spoken to, they're walkers, and it's only now that they're in their 50s that they are realizing more of the decreased functional capacity because of their spinal cord injury. But the way they hear about the NDIS through the media and this kind of thing, but they go to their GPs, and their GPs, I've heard multiple stories of GPs advising people with diagnosed spinal cord injuries saying, oh no, you can walk, you probably won't get access to the NDIS. Spinal cord injury has one of the highest access request rates of any sort of diagnosis. So I think there also needs to be an education process of health professionals, treating health professionals, because often they're the first point of contact for a lot of people applying for the NDIS. So there needs to be a lot better education around stakeholders, whether they're health professionals, whether they're social workers in hospitals, about the NDIS in general, but more specifically, the different diagnoses that will lead to successful access requests. But as Louise said, there really just needs to be a better understanding of what supports people need. It should be a supports-based system, not a deficits-based assessment.
Let's talk about choice and control when it comes to somebody who is planning for an NDIS, for whether it's the first time or the 50th time. The expectation for somebody going in the NDIS and the words choice and control indicates that they are going to be able to choose the supports that they get to be able to control their own functional, independent lives.
Yes, I have so much to say on this one.
Go ahead.
So I think when the NDIS was coming in, we were all really excited about the notion of choice and control, and that people were going to have more flexibility. People could have one-to-one supports instead of having to have group supports, even if that meant they didn't have as much, but you got to do exactly what you wanted, and you could achieve your own individual goals and not just get put into a group situation for the day because that was, what kept you safe. It also came down to things like, if you're having supports with something like meal preparation, that you can choose and control where you're getting those meals from. Whereas now you have to get a quote, it takes months to be approved, and then they still make you use a particular provider for 12 months. If you want to change, you have to go back to them with a new quote every time. They say you don't, but you do. I haven't had a single participant that has been able to just change meal plan providers during the year without having to go back and get a planner to approve it, which again takes at least a month. So where is the choice there? Where is the control there? I get that they want to make sure that it's something people need and it's not being abused, but it's a support that makes a huge difference to so many people. If you are eating properly, you're less likely to get skin integrity issues, and you're less likely to end up with a pressure wound that could kill you.
Yeah, I guess this breaks down eligibility not just to try and get on the NDIS, but your disability is always being scrutinized for its eligibility of supports.
So I have in the past had clients that have really good supports set up. They've had funding for 2 or 3 plans for the same supports, and then a planner will come in and view things differently and actually specifically tell the client, you cannot spend your funding on X because your son lives with you, so he can mow the lawns. Never mind that the son is doing 7 hours a day of personal care, because that is that person's choice to have their son do it rather than a stranger. And never mind that then, having the lawns mowed, the cleaning done, and some meal prep done means he doesn't burn out and he can keep looking after his mother. And like, let alone the fact that that planner has absolutely no right under the legislation to tell someone how they can spend their core funding.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think it's really concerning because there is a really major fear across the community about the risk of eligibility reassessments. So even if you are a participant on the scheme, and even though you may have met the disability requirements and you have a permanent impairment and this kind of thing, people are constantly concerned about eligibility reassessments. And this sort of raised its head quite a bit this year in discussions about independent assessments as well. But I think if you just think about it in general, it's a really arbitrary system because you suddenly have to break down your life and say, this functional capacity is reduced because of the disability, and it is reduced with the disability, but people's lives are so much more complex than that. People have disabilities, people have chronic health conditions, and they all compound and impact on each other. And so then you have the NDIA coming over here and sort of saying, hey, we're only going to fund these supports, so you need to arbitrarily extract this because otherwise the NDIA isn't going to be liable. The health system is going to be liable because it's contingent on your chronic health condition, not your disability. And so it becomes a really arbitrary system for people to try and extract what causes what in their lives. Is it due to my disability? Is it due to my chronic health condition? And then suddenly, if the NDIA decides, hey, it's time for an eligibility reassessment to see whether you should continue on the scheme, I mean, that could just inspire the fear in people about their supports. And so it's really, really concerning that these areas aren't better understood and the complexities of people's day to day lives aren't better understood within the agency.
We have people who don't really understand disability. Does anybody want to talk about the financial burden of not being able to successfully support somebody in their version of a normal life?
Yeah, I think it's a really integrated question and it's really, really fascinating. I think the NDIS is special in so many ways because unlike so many welfare schemes in Australia and overseas, it is not means tested. So the recognition being that disability, we bring people to the same starting point if they have the right supports and services in place to live independent lives where they have choice and control. Um, but the problem is the way it's currently framed and the way the Council of Australian Governments have structured it is there is so many gaps between the NDIS and our other systems, whether it's health, justice, education across the board, and so much confusion about who is accountable for funding what. And this is just so absurd to me because at the end of the day, people need supports and services funded by someone. There needs to be better coordination and recognition that if the NDIS isn't funding that support or service, which may increase their functional capacity over the long term, it may be an initial output or investment, high cost AT, whatever it is. But maybe because they have that investment through the NDIS, it means that person doesn't fall out of their chair and injure themselves and then have to be admitted to hospital for um, injuries associated with those incidents. And so it's this recognition that looking at a whole of a person's life, investing in them through the NDIS and recognizing that this is investing in that whole person's life is a necessary and fundamental recognition of our obligations under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It seems so obvious to me, but there needs to be more integrated discussion between all stakeholders across different government departments, across service providers, across health professionals, and with participants and with NDIS applicants to better recognize that their normal lives will be empowered if we really empower them through the NDIS and schemes like the NDIS.
Well, I guess if you don't have supports to manage something that affects your life, you end up not being able to work because you're either in an immense amount of pain because you can't afford your own therapies and supports, or you're just in such a bad way mentally that you can't participate in the workforce. And so then you become a burden on income support systems. Whereas if you were supported as a person that, yep, we see you, we recognize you, here's some help to get to and from work, here's some support for, a modified work environment, here's support so that you can find an employer who's going to be understanding if you need days off for appointments, all of that kind of stuff that really would make a difference to someone being able to stay employed. And then that takes off that burden. If you've got to afford a bunch of expensive treatments for yourself, and Medicare is either going to be paying for part of that, or private health insurance is going to be paying for part of it, or the person is just going to be out of pocket completely, that also is a huge burden of cost somewhere. A lot of people that are on the NDIS are employed in some form. Then they should be entitled to use the services that are set up with those taxes.
Exactly. I 100% agree. Like, I think that's so true. If it's not funded by the NDIS, the cost will arise somewhere along the line. I've heard a million sort of different scenarios about how that cost arises. But when you have a person who doesn't have, in quotes, the right diagnosis to fit the NDIS eligibility criteria, that person may not receive supports and services in their home, and they may have to withgo them altogether. This is not just impacting the individual, it is impacting entire families, carers. There are just so many costs that can't be measured even in dollars. And this is why it's so disappointing to have discussions surrounding financial sustainability of the scheme, because it is so much more than that. It's about sustainability of individuals' lives, of their independence, their choice control. It's about sustainability of families, of communities. So why can't we acknowledge that if you have an impairment and functional capacity is reduced in several domains of life, if that diagnosis is not sort of necessarily a diagnosis that fits within the box, you still have to see what that person's life looks like in reality and recognize that they will benefit so much from the supports that the NDIS can provide.
Would it change due to the severity of the disability? Like, would it be sped up in any way? Do you know?
So, age is definitely something that listeners may have heard me speak about already surrounding eligibility, but it does have a really dramatic effect. If you're age 64, you enter hospital with a spinal cord injury, and you're thrown into the mix of potentially for the first time thinking about accessing supports via the NDIS. There's a time limit. There is a very significant time limit, because that age restriction of 65, you have to make your access request before you turn 65. After that, subsequent reviews and appeals might be ongoing and that kind of thing, but you have to make it before you're 65. Otherwise, by default, you have to go through the aged care system. This is particularly significant because in some hospitals, in some units, and this kind of thing, and this goes back to the expertise of the people assisting you in making an access request. In some hospitals, that expertise just doesn't exist. So there is talk of potentially cases being forwarded in the courts about surrounding the discrimination involved for this cohort of people who were age 64 when the NDIS came in to their area, but potentially due to practical barriers were unable to apply, or a lack of information or knowledge and this kind of thing about the scheme. But it's really concerning, because it may just be the practical limitation of not having access to the right materials, or being able to afford the right assessments to get access to the scheme. And then suddenly, instead of looking at potentially becoming eligible for a plan where you get $165,000 per annum, you're looking at max with a home care package getting $52,000. And that may just be the difference of a couple of days. because you've turned 65?
I mean, I haven't had a lot of experience with kind of at that sort of stage because it's usually been pretty clear cut. I have had someone recently who got given a 6-month plan, and I was really clear with her of when we come to do the plan review, you need to be absolutely adamant and determined that you want to remain a participant, because by the time her plan ends, and she was a discharge from hospital, and it was almost like they've given her enough to get her home, but then they were like, well, maybe we can move her onto my aged care in 6 months' time. And for this particular person, their disability wasn't newly acquired. They've had it for many years. They've tried to get access and been declined because walking spinal cord injury. But having to go into hospital, that meant she had a lot more support around her to actually complete the paperwork and get the assessments done. There was evidence of, the impact that it's having on her life, and the fact that she's had to go to hospital because of pain and, trouble getting up the stairs in her unit. Yeah, having things like that happen, like suddenly she was eligible, but her diagnosis hasn't changed and her support needs haven't changed since when she tried on her own.
Spoken about this before, where the actual cost of somebody's care because of a disability that they cannot help is actually quite a lot, and to only preference certain people means that certain people are going to be left behind. Some other eligibility issues that might arise when it comes to getting on the NDIS, and I've listed here in particular palliative care and eligibility for NDIS.
Yep. So I've got a few clients that are experiencing primary progressive multiple sclerosis. So it can be stable for ages and then decline rapidly. One of the participants has been told, not formally, but we've had like planners that have thrown away comments such as, well, are you going to need a new wheelchair if you're declining this quickly? Yeah. And should we really buy you a ceiling hoist now if you might only have 6 months left to live? Even though, it's very necessary, otherwise the OT wouldn't recommend it. Can't we just patch this wheelchair up? Do you need a whole new one? Yeah.
So what do you think that does to the I guess the not self-esteem, but the confidence that people have in themselves, and even if they are in palliative care, or even if they have got an allotted time left?
If you're trying really hard to have as much quality of life as you possibly can because you don't know how much longer you've got, you're trying to maintain good relationships with your family, with your friends, in a situation that it's already really, really difficult to maintain those because your whole life is about being cared for. People don't need to be told, well, are you worth spending this money on? Because we don't think so.
So with that in mind, and the people who are unable to be eligible for the NDIS in the first place, do you maybe want to talk, Megan, a little bit about the changes to the permanence criteria?
There are lots of changes underway. We're anticipating lots of changes this year with discussions around independent assessments and changes to reasonable and necessary. But the government has released its draft legislation, and it has just closed its public consultation on its new legislative package. The legislation is very different to what we thought it would initially look like, but it does have implications for eligibility. Essentially, what will be changing in terms of eligibility are changes to some of the eligibility provisions in the Act, but specifically changes to the becoming a participant rules. Psychosocial disabilities are going to be recognised as permanent disabilities or permanent impairment. The nature of their disability or the impact or their impairment, it may be episodic in nature. They have periods of good months, period good year, bad year, so on and so forth. However, I think there are a few gaps. As always, some of those gaps are just generally why have we sort of confined it to psychosocial conditions? It did come out of a lot of the recommendations from the Tune Review in 2019, so it is in direct response to that, but I think there is the opportunity to expand it because the changes really have an impact on the potential evidence that people will have. So recognizing that people with psychosocial disabilities, I think the new wording in the legislation is something along the lines of a person will still be considered to have a permanent disability if they have had a treatment, they've receive treatment and after a reasonable period of time, their condition has not substantially improved. There are lots of ambiguities in what is a reasonable period of time and what is an appropriate treatment, and so on and so forth.
We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail later in other episodes, but when they're trying to justify the amount of spending versus somebody's quality of life versus somebody's real normal life, there can be an issue around equipment that you get from the NDIS can't really be recycled anywhere. That comes at an extra expense and an extra burden to the system. If somebody can't use something for one reason or another, what are your thoughts around recycling? Or, I guess there's cost effectiveness there, but just for somebody to be able to be given the opportunity, they may be able to get that equipment faster if it were possible to recycle that.
So that's how it used to work with Enable, is that if you needed something, you had it for as long as you needed it. It got repaired, replaced. You could swap it out for something if it was no longer suitable. I mean, it's difficult with things that are highly customized, but for things like hoists, absolutely, like they should still be able to be perma-hired, I guess. We've had people that have waited ages to get a hoist, whereas with Enable, it would have been with them, within a few weeks in the old scheme. So, that's really challenging for people, especially that have been accessing equipment through Enable historically as well, that they're like, well, it used to not take 6 months to get an answer on something, and I used to just be able to continue my life and not have to worry about if I was going to be able to get out of bed and get to work because my hoist had broken down. Like, it places a huge burden on participants and their families, because like they've got to get rid of this equipment if they don't need it, and they don't know how, and it's really overwhelming to try and sell something that's so specialized. Like, there are websites set up now to try and help, but like I've got a client that isn't computer savvy, so like the NDA will say, well, just list it on Gumtree and you can sell it, it's yours, but she would have no ability to do that. So then who helps her to get rid of this huge bulky piece of equipment before she gets the new one?
I think it's a really interesting discussion, because I think it's part of a wider piece around assistive technology in Australia, and also sort of acknowledging that the majority of people with disability across Australia don't have access to the NDIS. I think the agency has a role to play in developing a wider market for both NDIS participants and for other people with disability who aren't eligible for individual packages, in fostering a well-developed secondhand assistive technology market, and facilitating that through working with stakeholders and AT suppliers and this kind of thing, and by establishing national standards for accreditation, recustomization, and this kind of thing, and a lot of the issues that Louise was talking about, because it would just facilitate so many different things. And it goes back to, it shouldn't necessarily be the burden of the NDIS, but the NDIS has a big role to play in potentially the recycling of equipment and the reuse of equipment, even highly customized equipment, because there may be someone out there that could benefit from that hoist or from a chair or whatever that AT looks like. And this, it's part of a wider discussion, but I think there's a role to play here.
Because I feel like if you have the capability to be able to reuse and recycle equipment, and then that person gets that equipment sooner, the eligibility to be able to fund said equipment for somebody else for the first time would probably not need to be such an issue. Wheelchairs, for example, have maybe a lifespan of 5 years per wheelchair for somebody who has a spinal cord injury, who's actively seeking exercise physio, who's active in the community. Their body will change just like everybody else's. It will fluctuate. It will trim down, or whatever it is that you want to do. And then that equipment may not be the thing that you need. But if you took the back off somebody's wheelchair, put on another back, and then gave it to somebody with a different cushion that could also fit in that wheelchair, that could be completely life-changing for that person, even if they only have it for a year before they're able to get the actual equipment they need.
Completely agree.
I mean, you've got like the seating clinics that can customize cushions. So you could easily like take a power wheelchair, refurbish it, strip out the cushions that have been customized for one person and put in cushions that are customized for someone else. It would save a significant amount of money. It would get things moving much quicker for people.
Yeah, I think it's thinking outside of the box and thinking. And what's interesting to me is like I hear stories from people who aren't on the NDIS, often people who are aged over 65 and may not receive funding even via the aged care system, but they're thinking outside the box. So they've got sort of like their local bike repairman sort of customizing things that they found on the secondhand market and this kind of thing. The NDIS should have that innovative thinking about other avenues than just investing in a high cost piece of AT in a person's first plan, because those options do exist. I do wonder if it's because of a lack of development in the market and so they're waiting on those sort of service providers. But I think this is where the NDIA needs to take a role as market steward and lead the way in developing this.
So, well, if somebody has never met anybody on the NDIS before, or isn't connected to anybody who has a condition or a disability, why should they care?
You know, we should also care about the NDIS because you're only one car accident away from needing it yourself. You could fall down your steps in your house and sustain a spinal cord injury, and then you'll need the NDIS. And you don't want it to be a broken system. You want it to be one that will support you through that, change in your life, because it's huge and it's overwhelming. And the system shouldn't add more pressure to something that's already really stressful. Yeah, I've definitely got participants who have experienced that burnout. And, then the constant, okay, great, I've got funding, but it isn't exactly what I was hoping for. And so now I still feel burnt out.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think people or the agency needs to hear participants, listen to participants. They are the experts in their disability. And so we need to listen to them in terms of the supports that they need. The other aspect I would say is there just needs to be a lot more consultation and co production with the sector as a whole. The agency needs to talk to applicants who are from different groups, whether they're from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, whether they are participants who were rejected from hospital, all of these different experiences, whether it's related to access or planning and this kind of thing. There just needs to be a lot more consultation and understanding of what does navigating the NDIS actually look like. Following that consultation, there needs to be extensive periods of co-production of solution. The buzzword has always been co-design, but co-production involves a lot more than that. It's part you are involved, people with lived experience are involved in the design process, in the implementation, in the follow-up and monitoring of the entire policy or scheme or amendment and so on and so forth. And so I think education, co-production, listening to participants.
Everyone actually needs to be treated as an individual, because when someone's saying I need this support, it's 90% of the time because they genuinely need that support. Like, I haven't worked with very many people where I think, no, I don't think you need that. I would tell my clients, look, I don't think this is appropriate through the NDIS if it's something that I thought could be better funded elsewhere. So I don't have to have many of those discussions with my clients. So to me, if someone's saying to a government system, I need you to give me this bit of money, which you can afford to give me, then it should be given, especially when they've already met access requirements.
Yeah, I completely agree. My only addition would be, coming from the human rights background, is that we all are inherently imbued with dignity and human rights, and this is just recognition of that. We should care because it should be a rights-based system where we're supporting people. We're not just supporting the person with disability. I come back to we're supporting their entire family, their friends, their support networks, and this kind of thing. You're investing in people, in entire communities. And I think recognizing that is really important, and recognizing the value of the NDIS and the value of people.
You've been listening to the first episode of Have the Nerve for 2022. If you want more information on anything we've spoken about in this episode, please check the show notes in the description of this podcast. This podcast has been written, recorded, and edited by me, Susan Wood. Logo art by Cobie Ann Moore. And if you need help and support with your NDIS plan anywhere in Australia, SCIA offers support coordination and plan management for anyone with a disability. We also offer individual and systemic and family advocacy support for anyone living in New South Wales. To learn more about our services, please go to scia.org.au. If you like this podcast, please give us a 5-star review if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And we would really appreciate it if you shared this episode with someone you know. NDIS and disability advocacy is some of our most mentioned areas by our community, and we want to try and educate and inform as many people as we can. Thank you for listening.